So far, we've established that the primary motivation of the English colonies along the southern Atlantic coast and in the West Indies was to enrich the investors of joint stock companies and the Empire of England. In this next unit, we will further analyze the purpose of English colonies by introducing the concept of mercantilism. We will then identify the specific responsibilities of the colonies of North and South Carolina, those of the West Indies, and the colony of Georgia. Mercantilism is the economic system in which an empire builds colonies and controls those colonies' economic activity for the sole purpose of enriching the home nation. The intention is not to create territories that are equal or to allow them to become self-sufficient. Instead, what is produced within a colony is decided by the monarchy, and what is imported into a colony must be done so to benefit the nation. Mercantilism as a policy will be more expressly analyzed in Chapter 7 when we discuss the reason why the colonists became frustrated with the British government on the eve of the American Revolution. For now, it's important to understand that there was a commercial and political purpose to establishing each of the southern royal colonies, and that the English government dictated what types of exports they could produce. But no colonies were officially established in the South between 1634 and 1670 because England once again convulsed with civil war. Tired of answering to Parliament, King Charles I attempted to disband it in 1629 to reestablish his absolute right to rule the English Empire. The king was deposed and beheaded in the 1640s, and for a while England was ruled by a military dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. When the people of England found that Cromwell was no better than Charles I, Charles II was restored to the throne after promising to maintain certain rights of Englishmen, including the right to representation and the right to bear arms. It was in honor of the second Charles that Carolina and the capital of Charlestown were named. Like Lord Baltimore, Charles gave proprietorship of Carolina to his political allies, whose intentions were to grow and export rice to feed the British subjects growing sugar in the West Indies. You can see here an example of mercantilism. Though all the southern colonies were plantation colonies rooted in agriculture, each focused so intensely on a cash crop like tobacco and sugar that they needed to import cereal crops like rice from Carolina. Because of its ties to the West Indies, African slaves took hold in Carolina sooner and more intensely than in other parts of North America. Former West Indies plantation owners migrated to Carolina with their knowledge of rice growing and their slaves. Slavery and rice cultivation have already been deeply intertwined. Africans have a natural immunity to malaria, which spreads quickly by mosquitoes in rice paddies. So they were viewed as the ideal laborer for this particular crop. You can see that Carolina covered an expansive territory that stretched from the southern border of Virginia to the northern border of present-day Florida. Much of this wilderness was too far from the capital of Charlestown to control effectively. In fact, many of the squatters along the Carolinas' northern border had been landless farmers frustrated by the plantation elites of Virginia. They had illegally squatted on the unclaimed land and established small farms there without the consent of the Carolina proprietors. In 1712, Northern Carolinians petitioned the king to grant them a separate royal charter, which was granted. The economic conditions and independent attitudes of North Carolinians were distinctly different from those of their neighbors in Virginia and South Carolina. They and Rhode Island were the most American colonies of the original 13. They were independent-minded and less aristocratic. North Carolina embraced religious diversity and democracy. The last of the English American colonies to be developed was Georgia. While the other southern colonies were created for economic purposes, Georgia was created in 1733 to serve a political one. Founded 126 years after the foundation of Virginia, the first colony, and 52 years after Pennsylvania, the 12th, Georgians were fighting the wilderness almost as much as they were fighting the British during the American Revolution in the later half of the 18th century. King George II chartered the colony with the intention that it would buffer the plantation colonies from a Spanish invasion out of Florida. While other colonies were to make money for the crown, the king understood that Georgia would need to be subsidized, at least at its outset. How then do you get English people to populate a colony with limited prospects of making money and high prospects of being attacked by Spaniards? A group of philanthropists led by politician James Oglethorpe answered this question with a high-minded plan. England's prisons were overcrowded with men that had been incarcerated for failure to pay their debts. These institutions were expensive and teeming with pestilence. The founders of Georgia, especially Oglethorpe, who had become interested in prison reform when his friend died in debtor's jail, permitted prisoners to be transported to their colony. Once they were there, these men were no longer convicts, but indentured laborers who received 50 acres of land to farm once their service to their landlord was finished. Georgia was truly a place of high ideas. The founders prohibited African slavery. As a result, immigration to Georgia by English settlers was relatively low. Instead, it became a melting pot of colonial culture. Protestant Scots-Irish and Lutheran Germans began small communities in Georgia where all faiths but Catholicism was tolerated. European missionaries hoping to convert natives and reformed prisoners visited Oglethorpe's colony, including the missionary John Wesley, who came to work with these populations and later went back to England to form the Methodist Church, which today is the third largest Christian denomination in the United States.